GORMENGHAST. Chapter 34. It had been arranged that the staff should gather in the quadrangle outside the doctor's house at a few minutes past 9 and wait for Belgrove, who, as headmaster, had ignored the suggestion that he should be first on the spot and wait for them. Perch Prism's argument that it was a good deal more ludicrous for a horde of men to hang about as though they were hatching some kind of conspiracy than it would be for Belgrove, even though he was headmaster, cut no ice with the old lion. Belgrove, in his present mood, was peculiarly dogged. He had glowered over his shoulder at them as though he were at bay. "Never let it be said in future years," he had ended, "that a headmaster of Gormenghast had once to wait the pleasure of his staff's arrival, by night, in the South Quadrangle. Never let it be said that so responsible an office had sunk into such disrespect." And so it was that a few minutes after 9, a great blot formed in the darkness of the quadrangle as though a section of the dusk had coagulated. Belgrove, who had been hiding behind a pillar of the cloisters, had decided to keep his staff waiting for at least 5 minutes. But he was unable to contain his impatience. Not 3 minutes had passed since their arrival before his excitement propelled him forwards into the open gloom. When he was halfway across the quadrangle and could hear the muttering of their voices quite plainly, the moon slid out from behind a cloud. In the cold light that now laid bare the rendezvous, the red gowns of the professors burned darkly, the colour of wine. Not so Belgrove's. His ceremonial gown was of the finest white silk, embroidered across the back with a large G. It was a magnificent, voluminous affair, this gown, but the effect was a little startling by moonlight, and more than one of the waiting professors gave a start to see what appeared to be a ghost bearing down on them. The professors had forgotten the ceremonial robe of leadership. Dead Yawn had never worn it. For the smaller-minded of the staff, there was something irritating about this sartorial discrepancy of their gowns which gave the old man so unique an advantage, both decoratively and socially. They had all been secretly rather pleased to have the opportunity of wearing their red robes in public, although the public consisted solely of the doctor and his sister, for they didn't count each other. And now Belgrove, of all people, Belgrove! Their decrepit head had stolen with a single peal, as it were, the wealth of their red thunder. He could feel their discontent, short-lived though it was, and the effect of the recognition was to excite him still further. He tossed his white mane of hair in the moonlight and gathered his Arctic gown about him in a great sculptural swathe. "Gentlemen," he said, "silence, if you please. I thank you." He dropped his head so that with his face in deep shadow he could relax his features in a smile of delight at finding himself obeyed. When he raised his face, it was as solemn and as noble as before. "Are all who are here gathered present?" "What the bloody hell does that mean?" said a coarse voice out of the red gloom of the gowns, and immediately on top of Mulefire's voice, the staccato of Cutflower's laughter broke out in little clanks of sound. "Oh, la, if that isn't ripeness, la, are all who are here gathered present? Oh, la, what a tease the old man is, Lord help my lungs." Quite so, broke out a crisper voice. "What he was trying to ask, presumably," it was Shrivel speaking, "was whether everyone here was really here, or whether it was only those who thought themselves here when they weren't really here at all who were here. You see, it's quite simple, really, once you have mastered the syntax." Somewhere close behind the headmaster there was a sense of strangled body laughter, a horrible, inaudible affair, and then the sound of a deep bucketful of breath being drawn out of a well, and then Opus Fluke's mid-stomach voice. "Poor old Belgrove," it said. "Poor bloody Belgrove." And then the rumbling again, and a chorus of dark and stupid laughter. Belgrove was in no mood for this. His old face was flushed and his legs trembled. Fluke's voice had sounded very close, just behind his left shoulder. Belgrove took a step to the rear, and then turning suddenly with a whirl of his white gown, he swung his long arm, and at once he was startled at what he at first imagined was a complete triumph. His gnarled old fist had struck a human jaw. A quick, wild, and bitter sense of mastery possessed him, and the intoxicating notion that he had been underrating himself for 70-odd years, and that all unwittingly he had discovered in himself the man of action. But his exhilaration was short-lived, for the figure who lay moaning at his feet was not Opus Fluke at all, but the weedy and dyspeptic flannel cat, the only member of his staff who held him in any kind of respect. But Belgrove's prompt action had a sobering effect. "Flannel cat," he said. Let that be a warning to them. Get up, my man. You have done nobly. Nobly!" At that moment, something whisked through the air and struck an obscure member of the staff on the wrist. At his cry, for he was in real pain, Flannel Cat was at once forgotten. A small round stone was found at the feet of the obscure member, and every head was turned at once to the dusky quadrangle, but nothing could be seen. High up on the northern wall, where the windows appeared no larger than sky-holes, Steerpike, sitting with his legs dangling over one of the window-sills, raised his eyebrows at the sound of the cry so far below him, and piously closing his eyes, he kissed his catapult. "Whatever the hell that was, or wherever it came from, it does at least remind us that we are late, my friend," said Shrivel. "True enough," muttered Tread, who almost always trod heavily on the tail of his friend's remarks. "True enough." "Belgrove," said Perch Prism, "wake your ideas up, old friend, and lead the way in. I see that every light is blazing in the homestead of the Prunes. Oh, Lord, what a lot we are!" He moved his small pig-like eyes across the faces of his colleagues. "What a hideous lot we are! But there it is. There it is." "You're not much of a silk purse yourself," said a voice. "In we go, La, in we go," cried Cutflower. "Terribly gay now, terribly gay. We must all be terribly gay." Perch Prism slid up under Belgrove's shoulder. "My old friend," he said, "you haven't forgotten what I said about Irma, have you? It may be difficult for you. I have even more recent information. She's, dead nuts on you, old man. Dead nuts. Watch your step, Chief. Watch them carefully." "I will watch my steps, Perch Prism. Have no fear," said Belgrove, with a leer that his colleagues could in no way interpret. Spiregrain, Throd, and Splint stood hand in hand. Their spiritual master was dead. They were enormously glad of it. They winked at each other and dug one another in the ribs and then joined hands again in the darkness. A mass movement towards the gate of the Prunesquallors began. Within this gate there was nothing that could be called a front garden, merely an area of dark red gravel which had been raked by the gardener. The parallel lines formed by his rake were quite visible in the moonlight. He might have saved himself the trouble, for within a few moments the neat, striated effect was a thing of the past. Not a square red inch escaped the shuffling and stamping of the Professor's feet. Hundreds of footprints of all shapes and sizes, crossing and recrossing, toes and heels superimposed with such freaks of placing that it seemed as though among the professors there were some who boasted feet as long as an arm, and others who must have found it difficult to balance upon shoes that a monkey might have found too tight. After the bottleneck of the garden gate had been negotiated, and the wine-red horde, with Belgrove at its van like an oriflamme, were before the front door, the headmaster turned with his hand hovering at the height of the bell-pull, and raising his iron-like head, was about to remind his staff that as the guests of Irma Prunesquallor he hoped to find in their deportment and general behaviour that sense of decorum which he had so far had no reason to suppose they possessed or could even simulate, when a butler, dressed up like a Christmas cracker, flung the front door open with a flourish which was obviously the result of many years' experience. The speed of the door as it swung on its hinges was extraordinary, but what was just as dramatic was the silence. A silence so complete that Belgrove, with his head turned towards his staff and his hand still groping in the air for the bell-pull, could not grasp the reason for the peculiar behaviour of his colleagues. When a man is about to make a speech, however modest, he is glad to have the attention of his audience. To see on every face that stared in his direction an expression of intense interest, but an interest that obviously had nothing to do with him, was more than disturbing. What had happened to them? Why were all their eyes out of focus? Or if they were in focus, why should they skim his own, as though there were something absorbing about the woodwork of the high green door behind him? And why was Throd standing on tiptoe in order to look through him? Belgrove was about to turn, not because he thought there could be anything to see, but because he was experiencing that sensation that causes men to turn their heads on deserted roads in order to make sure they are alone. But before he could turn of his own free will, he received 2 sharp yet deferential knuckle taps on his left shoulder blade, and leaping about, as though at the touch of a ghost, he found himself face to face with the tall Christmas cracker of a butler. "You will pardon me, sir, for making free with my knuckle, I am sure, sir," said the glittering figure in the hall. "But you are impatiently awaited, sir, and no wonder, if I may say so." "If you insist," said Belgrove. "So be it." His remark meant nothing at all, but it was the only thing he could think of to say. "And now, sir," continued the butler, lifting his voice into a higher register, which gave quite a new expression to his face, "if you will be so gracious as to follow me, I will lead the way to Madam." He moved to one side and cried out in the darkness, "Forward, gentlemen, if you please," and turning smartly on his heel, he began to lead Belgrove through the hall and down a number of short passageways, until a wider space at the foot of a flight of stairs brought him and his followers to a halt. "I have no doubt, sir," the butler said, inclining himself reverentially as he spoke, and to Belgrove's way of thinking the man was speaking overmuch. "I have no doubt, sir, that you are familiar with the customary procedure." "Of course, my man, of course," said Belgrove. "What is it?" "Oh, sir," said the butler, "you are very humorous." And he began to titter, an unpleasant sound to come from the top of a cracker. "There are many procedures, my man. Which one were you referring to, "To the one, sir, that pertains to the order in which the guests are announced. By name, of course, as they file through the doorway of the salon. It is all very cut and dried, sir." "What is the order, my dear fellow, if it is not the order of seniority?" "And so it is, sir, in all respects, save that it is customary for the headmaster, which would be you, sir, to bring up the rear." The rear?" "Quite so, sir. As a kind of shepherd, I suppose, sir, driving his flock before him, as it were." There was a short silence, during which Belgrove began to realize that to be the last to present himself to the hostess, he would be the first to hold any kind of conversation with her. "Very well," he said. "The tradition must, of course, remain inviolate. Ridiculous as it seems in the face of it, I shall, as you put it, bring up the rear. Meanwhile, it is getting late. There is no time to sort out the staff into age groups and so on. None of them are chickens. Come along now, gentlemen, come along. And if you will be so kind as to stop combing your hair before the door is opened, Cutflower, I would, as one who is responsible for his staff, be grateful. Thank you." Just then the door which faced the staircase opened, and a long rectangle of gold light fell across the section of the embattled masters. Their gowns flamed, their faces shone like spectres. Turning almost simultaneously after a few minutes of dazzling blankness, they shuffled into the surrounding shadow. Around the corner of the open door through which the light was pouring, a large face peered out at them. "Name!" it whispered thickly. An arm crept around the door and drew the nearest figure forwards and into the light by a fistful of wine-red linen. "Name!" it whispered again. "The name is Cutflower La," hissed the gentleman. "But take your great joint of clod's fist off me, you stupid bastard!" Cutflower, whose gusts of temper were rare and short-lived, was really angry at being pulled forward by his gown and in having it clenched so clumsily into a web of creases. "Let go!" he repeated hotly. "By hell, I'll have you whipped, La!" The crude footman bent down and brought his lip to Cutflower's ear. "I will kill you," it whispered, but in such an abstracted way as to give Cutflower quite a turn. It was as though the fellow was passing on a scrap of inside information, casually, like a spy, but in confidence. Before Cutflower had recovered, he found himself pushed forward, and he was suddenly alone in the long room. Alone, except for a line of servants along the right-hand wall and away ahead of him, his host and hostess, very still, very upright in the glow of many candles. Had Belgrove worked out beforehand the order in which to have his staff announced, it is unlikely that he would have hit upon so happy an idea as that of choosing Cutflower from his pack and leading off, as it were, with a card so lacking in the solid virtues. But chance had seen to it that of all of the gowns it was Cutflower's that should have been within range of the groping hand, and Cutflower, the volatile and fatuous Cutflower, as he stepped lightly like a wagtail across the grey-green roods of carpet, was, in spite of the shocking start he had been given, injecting the air, the cold expectant air, with something no other member of the staff possessed in the same way, a warmth or a gaiety of a kind, but not a human gaiety. Rather, it was glass-like, a sparkling, twinkling quality. It was as though Cutflower was so glad to be alive that he had never lived. Every moment was vivid, a coloured thing, a trill or a crackle of words in the air. Who could imagine, while Cutflower was around, that there were such vulgar monsters as death, birth, love, art, and pain around the corner? It was too embarrassing to contemplate. If Cutflower knew of them, he kept it secret. Over their gaping and sepulchral deeps he skimmed, now here, now there, in his private canoe, changing his course with a flick of his paddle when death's black whale, or the red squid of passion, lifted for a moment its body from the brine. He was not more than a third of the way to his hosts, and the echo of the stentorian voice which had flung his name across the room was hardly dead, and yet, with his wagtail walk, his spruceness, his perky, ductile features so ready to be amused, and so ready to amuse as long as no one took life seriously, he had already broken the ice for the Prunesquallors. There was a certain charm in his fatuity, his perkiness. His toe-caps shone like mirrors. His feet came down, tap, 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 in a way all their own. The professors, craning their necks as they watched his progress, breathed more easily. They knew now that they could never accomplish that long carpet journey with anything like Cutflower's air, but he reminded them at every footstep, every inclination of the head, that the whole point of life was to be happy. And oh, the charm of it! The artless charm of it! When Cutflower, with but a few feet to go, broke into a little dancing run, and putting forward both his hands, cupped them over the limp white fingers which Irma had extended. "Oh, la la!" he had cried, his voice running all the way back down the salon. "This is, my dear Miss Prunesquallor, this positively is!" And turning to the doctor, "Isn't it?" he added as he clasped the outstretched hand, squaring his shoulders and shaking his head happily as he did so. "Well, I hope it will become so, my friend," cried Prunesquallor. "And how good to see you! And by the by, Cutflower, you give me heart, you do. By all that revivifies, I thank you from its bottom. Don't disappear now for the whole evening, will you?" Irma leaned across her brother and drew her lips apart in a dead, wide and calculated smile. It was meant to express many things, and among them the sense of how unconditionally she associated herself with her brother's sentiment. It also tried to imply that for all her qualities as a femme fatale, she was little more than a wide-eyed girl at heart and terribly vulnerable. But it was early in the evening, and she knew she must make many mistakes before her smiles came out right. Cutflower, whose eyes were still on the doctor, was fortunate enough to be unaware of Irma's blandishment. He was about to say something when the loud and common voice from the other end of the room brayed forth, "Professor Mulefire!" And Cutflower turned his head gaily from its hosts and shielded his eyes in imitation of a lookout man scanning some distant horizon. With a quick, delighted smile and a twirl of his dapper body, he was away to the side tables, where, with his elbows raised very high, he worked his 10 fingers together in a knot as he passed his eye along the wines and delicacies. Self-absorbed, he rocked to and fro on the sides of his shoes. How different was Mulefire, with his long, clumsy, irritable strides. And indeed, how disparate were all who followed one another that evening with only the colour of their gowns in common. Flannel Cat, like a lost soul for whom the journey was a mile at least, the heavy, sloppy, untidy Fluke, who looked as though for all his strength and for all the forward thrust of his loaf-like jaw, he might at any moment fold up at the knees and go to sleep on the carpet. Perch Prism, horribly alert, his porcine features shining white in the glow of the candles, his button-black eyes darting to and fro as he moved crisply with short, aggressive steps. With this shape and that shape, with this walk and that walk, they emerged from the hall to the tocsin bray of their names, until Belgrove found himself alone in the semi-darkness. As one after another of the professional guests had made their carpet journey towards her, Irma had had a world of time in which to ruminate on the vulnerability of each to the charm she would so soon be unleashing. Some, of course, were quite impossible, but even as she dismissed them, she began to brood with favour upon such phrases as rough diamond, heart of gold, still waters. While the sides of the room filled with those who had presented themselves, and their conversation became louder and louder as their numbers increased, Irma, standing rigid by her brother, speculating upon the pros and cons of those she had received, was wakened out of a more than usually sanguine speculation by her brother's voice. "And how is Irma, that sister of mine, that sweet throb? Is she cooing? Is she weary of the flesh? Or isn't she? Great spearheads, Irma, how determined, how martial you look! Relax a little, melt within yourself. Think of milk and honey. Think of jellyfish. Be quiet!" she hissed out of the corner of a smile she was concocting, a smile more ambitious than she had so far dared to invent. Every muscle in her face was pulling its weight. Not all of them knew in which direction to pull, but their common enthusiasm was formidable. It was as though all her previous contortions were mere rehearsals. Something in white was approaching. The something in white was moving slowly, but with more purpose than for over 40 years. While he had waited, sitting quietly by himself on the lower step of the Prunesquallor staircase, Belgrove had repeated to himself, his lips moving to the slow rhythm of his thoughts, those conclusions he had come to. He had decided, intellectually, that Irma Prunesquallor, dwarfed by lack of outlet for her feminine instincts, could find fruition in a life devoted to his comforts. That not only he, but she, in years to come, would bless the day when he, Belgrove, was man enough, was sapient enough, to lift her from stagnation and set her marching through matrimony towards that equipoise of spirit that only wives can know. There were 100 rational reasons why she should leap at the chance, in spite of his advanced years. But what weight had all these arguments for a fine and haughty lady, sensitive as a blood-horse and gowned like a queen, if at the same time there was no love? And Belgrove remembered, as he had crossed the quadrangle an hour ago, how it was this point that irked him. But now it was not the tightness of his reasoning that set his old knees trembling. It was something more. For, from a wise and practical project, the whole conception had been shifted into another light. His ideas had suddenly been overlaid with stars. What was precise was now enormous, unsubstant, diaphanous, for he had seen her. And tonight it was not merely the doctor's sister that awaited him, but a daughter of Eve, a living focus, a cosmos, a pulse of the great abstraction, woman. Was her name Irma? Her name was Irma. But what was the name Irma but 4 absurd little letters in a certain order? To hell with symbols, cried Belgrove to himself. She is there, by God, from head to foot, and matchless. It was true that he had only seen her from a distance, and it is possible that the distance lent an enchantment self-engendered. No doubt his sight was not as sharp as it used to be, and the fact that he could not remember having seen any other woman for many years gave Irma a flying start. But he had obtained a general picture as he peered through a narrow chasm of light that shone between Throd's and Spiregrain's bodies. And he had seen how proudly she held herself, stiff as a soldier, and yet how feminine. That is what he would like to have about him in the evening. A stately type. He could imagine her sitting bolt upright at his side, her face twitching a little from gentle breeding, her snow-white hands darning away at his socks while he pondered on this and that, turning his eyes from time to see whether it was really true, that she was really there, his wife, on the chocolate-coloured couch. And then suddenly he had found himself alone. The big face was peering for him from the door. "Name!" it whispered hoarsely, for its voice was almost gone. "I'm the headmaster, you idiot," barked Belgrove. He was in no mood for fools. Something was in his blood. Whether it was love or not, he must find out soon. There was an impatient streak in him, and this was no moment in which to suffer the man gladly. The creature with the big face, seeing that Belgrove was the last to be announced, took a deep breath, and to get rid of his pent-up irritability, for he was an hour late for his appointment with the blacksmith's wife, gathered all the forces of his throat together and yelled. But his voice collapsed after the first syllable, and only Belgrove heard the guttering sound that was intended for master. But there was something rather fine, rather impressive in the abbreviation. Something less formal, it is true, but more penetrating in the first simple syllable. "The head!" The short hammer blow of the monosyllable reverberated along the room like a challenge. It struck like a drumstick on the membranes of Irma's ear, and Belgrove, peering forward as he took his first paces into the room, had the impression of his hostess rearing herself up on her hips, tossing her head before it froze into a motionless carving. His heart, that was already beating wildly, had leapt at the sight. Her attention was riveted upon him. Of that there was no doubt. Not only her attention, but the attention of all those present. He became aware of a lethal hush. Soft as the carpet was, his feet could be heard as they lowered themselves, one after another, into the grey-green of the pile. For a moment, as he moved with that fantastic solemnity which the urchins of Gormenghast were so fond of mimicking, he gave his eyes the run of his staff. There they stood, 3 deep, a solid wine-red phalanx that completely obscured the side tables. Yes, he could see Perch Prism, his eyebrows raised, and Opus Fluke with his horse's mouth half open in a grin so inane that for a moment it was difficult for Belgrove to regain that composure necessary for the advancement of his immediate interests. So they were waiting to see in what way he would try to evade the predatory Irma, were they? So they expected him to back away from her immediately after he had received his formal reception, did they? So they looked for an evening of hide-and-seek between their hostess and their headmaster, the low curs. By the light of the militant heaven he would show the dogs. He would show them. And by the powers he would surprise them too. By now he was about halfway along the carpet, already trodden into a recognizable highway, the pile of the carpet throwing out a greener sheen than elsewhere, the pile pressed forward by 100 feet. Irma, her eyes weak with peering, could just see him. As he approached, and the blurred edges of his swan-white gown and the contours of his leonine head grew sharper, she marvelled at his godlike quality. She had received so many half-men that she had tired, not of numbers, but of waiting for the kind of male she could reverence. There had been the perky ones, and the stolid ones, and the sharp ones, and the blunt ones. All males, she supposed, but although she had a few of them at the back of her mind for further consideration, yet she had been sadly disappointed. There had been that irritating bachelor quality about them, a kind of dead self-sufficiency, a terrible thing in a man, who is, as every woman knows, a mere tag-end of a thing before the distaff side has stitched him together. But here was something different, something old, it is true, but something noble. She manoeuvred with her mouth. It had had a good deal of practice by this time, and the smile she prepared for Belgrove reflected to a great extent what she had in mind for it. Above all, it was winsome, devastatingly winsome. For a pretty face to be winsome is normal enough, and very winsome it can be, but it is a tepid thing, a negative thing compared with the winsomeness to which Irma could subject her features. With her it was as startling as any foreground symbol set against an incongruous background. Irma's weak and eager eyes, Irma's pinnacle of a nose, Irma's length of powdered face, these were the incongruous background to which the smile deployed its artful self. She played with it for a moment or two, as an angler with a fish, and then she let it set like concrete. Her body had simultaneously rhythmed itself into a stance both statuesque and snake-like. Her thorax, amplified with its hot water bottle bosom, positioned in air so far to the left of her pelvis as to have no visible means of support. Her snow-white hands were clasped at her throat where her jewellery sparkled. Belgrove was almost upon her. "This," he said to himself, breathing deeply, "is one of those moments in a man's life when valour is tested." The years ahead hung on his every move. His staff had shaken hands with her as though a woman was merely another kind of man. Fools! The seeds of Eve were in this radiant creature. The lullabies of 500,000 years throbbed in her throat. Had they no sense of wonder, no reverence, no pride? He, an old man, but a not unhandsome one, would show the dogs the way of it. And there she was, before him, the maddeningly feminine bouquet of her pineapple perfume swimming about his head. He inhaled. He trembled. And then, lion-like, he tossed his venerable mane from his eyes, and raising his shoulders as he took her hand in his, he bowed his head above their milky limpness and planted in the damp of her palms the first 2 kisses he had given for over 50 years. To say that the frozen silence contracted itself into a yet higher globe of ice were to underrate the exquisite tension and to shroud it in words. The atmosphere had become a physical sensation. As, when before a masterpiece, the acid throat contracts and words are millstones, So when the supernaturally outlandish happens, and a masterpiece is launched through the medium of human gesture, then all human volition is withered at the source, and the heart of action stops beating. Such a moment was this. Irma, a stalagmite of crimson stone, knew for all the riot in her veins that a page had turned over. At chapter 40? Oh no! At chapter 1, for she had never lived before, save in a pulseless preface. How long did they remain thus? How many times had the earth moved around the sun? How many times had the great blue whales of the northern waters risen to spurt their fountains at the sky? How many reedbucks had fallen to the claws of how many leopards, while that sublime unit of two-figure statuary remained motionless? It is fruitless to ask. The clocks of the world stood still, or should have done. But, at last, the Arctic stillness broke. A professor at the side table gave forth a sharp scream, whether of laughter or nerves was never established. The doctor glanced across at the wine-red gowns, his eyebrows raised, his teeth glinting. There were a few beads of moisture on his forehead. He was going through a lot. Irma had not consciously heard the sharp cry of laughter, or knew what had broken her from a trance, but she found herself inclining her head graciously above the white locks of the headmaster's reverential poll. This was it. Something within her was laughing wildly, like cowbells. It was a pity that the headmaster could not appreciate the amplitude of her graciousness as she hung above him, but there it was. She couldn't have it both ways. But wait, what was this? Oh, sweetest mercy! And the wild thorn throbs of it! What was he doing, the great, gentle, august, brilliant lion? He was raising his eyes to hers with his lips still pressed against her fingers. It was as though he had divined her most secret thoughts. She lowered her lids and found that his dead pebble eyes were upon hers. With their gaze directed upwards and through the white tangle of the eyebrows, they appeared to be caged. She knew the moment to be enormous in its implications, in its future, but she knew also, as a woman, that she must draw her hand away. As the first suspicion of a movement crept through her flaccid fingers, Belgrove lifted his head, withdrew his big hands from hers, and at that moment Irma's bosom began to slip. In the complex arrangement of strings, safety pins, and tape which held the hot water bottle in place, time had found a weakness. But Irma, tingling with excitement, was in so elevated a frame of body and mind that beyond her capacity, as it were, her brain was planning for her in advance those things she should do and say, in or out of any emergency. And this was one of those moments when the cells of Irma's brain marched in solid ranks to her rescue. Her bosom was slipping. She clasped her hands together at her throat so that her forearms might keep the hot water bottle in place, and then, with every eye upon her, she lifted her head high and began to pace towards the doorway at the far end of the salon. She had not even glanced at her brother, but with a quite overweening confidence had started away, the folds of her evening gown trailing behind her. The bottle had become horribly cold across her chest, but she revelled in its cruel temperature. Why should she care about such little things? Something on an altogether vaster scale was bearing her on its flood. The barb had stuck. She was naked. She was proud. Had love's arrow not been metaphorical, she would have held it high in the air for all to see. And all this she was making plain by the very movement of her pacing body and by the volcanic blush which had turned her marmoreal head into something that might have been found among the blood-red ruins of some remote civilization. Her jewellery took on another tint. Her blush burned through it. But her expression bore no relation to the blush. It was strangely articulate, and thus frighteningly simple. There was no need for words. Her face was saying, "I am in his power. He has awakened me. I, a mere woman, have been blasted into sentience. Whatever the future holds, it will not be through me that love goes hungry. I am aware not only that history is being made, but of my duty, even at this pinnacled moment. And so I am leaving the room to readjust myself, to compose myself, and to bring back into the salon the kind of woman that the headmaster may admire. No quivering love-struck damsel, but a dame, in all the high sensuousness of her sex, a dame, composed and glorious." Irma, directly she had reached the door and had swept out into the hall, flew, a silken spinster, up the flight of stairs to her room. Slamming the door behind her, she gave vent to the primeval jungle in her veins and screamed like a macaw, and then, prancing forward towards the bed, tripped over a small embroidered footstool and fell spread-eagled across the carpet. What did it matter? What did anything ridiculous or shaming matter so long as he was not there to see it?